All right, why don't we go ahead and get started? It's an absolutely beautiful day here in Berkeley, so if you'd rather be outside, I can understand that, but we're going to be together for the next hour and 18 minutes or so. This is a continuation, actually, of Lecture 5, for those of you that are following the scorecard, and I will endeavor to then also complete Lecture 6, so I'm going to try to move fairly efficiently. I want to take you back to our study of Emil Durkheim, who I've offered you as sort of our first sort of sociological theoretical framework for thinking about punishment. We've looked at some frameworks that come from disciplines like psychology and economics and philosophy, which have been very helpful, I think, in thinking about the motivations to punish. But as we begin to look at penal change, I mean, actually step back. When we think about the individual motivations to punish, what we often notice is the continuities in punishment across history and across societies. People are doing something that looks recognizably like punishing other people in very ancient societies, current ones all around the world. Indeed, last spring, when I took my family on a tour of Roman sites in Europe, where we were staying at the time, we visited Bath. I don't know, have any of you ever visited Bath, England, which is a fantastic Roman ruin there, as I think you'll attest. It's actually one of the most remarkable Roman sites in the world. This was a natural hot spring that they understood to be a presence of the goddess Athena, perhaps, or one of their major goddesses. This is actually the only place in the Roman religious world where the goddesses or gods were actually coming to people rather than being sort of gathered by people, invoked by them. In any event, in recent years, they've done a lot of archaeology trying to. This hot pool, part of it was actually a fantastic Roman bath. That's what you see when you come to the top. But there's also essentially a sacred site where messages could be sent to the deity. And in recent years, they've actually recovered. I don't know if you saw some of these. They've been able to recover essentially texts that were preserved in essentially the mud at the bottom of this natural hot springs. And so we have letters essentially that people were writing to the gods, one of the only portals in their whole world where they could communicate directly with God. And what would we find in these messages? Overwhelmingly, they are curses. They're asking the gods to punish people for things like stealing a cloak, stealing a pair of sandals, and other assorted crimes. So we see that punishment is one of the most enduring traits in human civilization. And I think psychology, economics, philosophy all help us understand that. But then, as we've begun to see, there's tremendous variation in what people get punished for, how they get punished, what kinds of responses those punishments are supposed to produce in the people either experiencing them or watching them or administering them. And how do we understand those? That's where sociology and history, political science, in some ways the field to treat society in a more collective basis, come in very handy. Now, Durkheim's the first but not the last of these sort of social theory toolkits that we're going to be introduced to, but as I hinted last time, in many ways it's the most comprehensive and most powerful. It's sort of your desert isle social theorist. If you can only take one, you take Durkheim. Now, I talked last time some about his theory of crime and punishment. I wanted to tie that back together. I talked very briefly about, at the end, in a rushed way, about the relationship between the law, including the penal law on the one hand, and what Durkheim called social solidarity on the other. We talked about the fact that for Durkheim, even though we're individuals, we don't actually have to just be motivated to behave in a pro-social way by incentives, the way the economist assumed, because integral to our own sense of self is a sort of set of collective, if you will, values or beliefs or fundamental convictions that we inherit through our parenting, through school, things of this nature. And those already embody a social sense. We don't have to come to society from an atomized self. By the time we understand ourselves as a self, that includes this social dimension of our consciousness. And for Durkheim, this is what makes him such an interesting sociologist of the law. He thinks that when you're looking at a legal code of a society, you are, in a sense, looking at a pictogram of the social solidarity that binds that society together. Now, a lot of people assume that, therefore, he doesn't think there's anything complicated about the way laws come into being, et cetera, or that there aren't conflicts in society around the politics of law, and that's not very credible when you consider his role in the Dreyfus affair, which I talked about last time. He clearly wasn't naive about power, about wrongful convictions, about factionalization in society, but he did believe that the law, on some level, may be distorted through various mechanisms, but he thought there was a relationship. When you look at the legal code, you're seeing, at least in a representative form, perhaps distorted, clues to these deep underlying solidarities. And for him, the penal code, or the penal parts of our law, represent the most ancient, oldest, deepest, and also most sort of volatile, emotional, hot part of that solidarity. And in a sense, he views the legal code sort of like that volcano I just showed you, sort of having layers moving from the oldest and hottest parts to cooler, more recent parts. Did I skip? There we go. Repressive law, the penal law, corresponds to what is the heart and center of the common consciousness, this part of our sense of self that is the social part. Purely moral rules are already a less central part. Lastly, he says restitutory law, so civil law, contracts, torts, property, springs from the farthest zones of consciousness and extends well beyond them. The more it becomes truly itself, the more it takes its distance. Let's talk about penal law and this mechanical solidarity, as he calls it. That is the deepest level of our social solidarity and of our legal system. Now, this is the part where Durkheim was probably wrong about the history, but has some great insight. For Durkheim, or Durkheim, I should say, asserted that in the history of presumably all societies and legal systems, that the penal law was the original part of the law, and that what we think of as the civil law sort of came later. And he thought that if you went to ancient societies and looked at them, you would find nothing but penal law. Now, he was just dead wrong about this. Roman law, obviously, had a vast body of civil law associated with it. He might have argued that Rome was sort of an exception, a kind of pre-modern but modern society. But even if we look at very traditional societies that don't even have formal legal institutions, we tend to find that they're not all about penal law. They're often much more about mediation and reconciliation, negotiation, things that seem to have more in common with our civil law system. But don't worry too much about Durkheim's history, which was mostly rubbish. The valuable part is his insights about the relationship between these deep moral values and the penal law. We don't have to assume that the penal law is necessarily the first part of the law, or that it's made up the totality of law in traditional societies to believe that there's an important connection between the penal law on the one hand and our deepest values, the ones that generate the most emotions in us. Now, as I said last time, this mechanical solidarity is one that Durkheim saw as arising primarily from the recognition that people had for each other in very traditional societies as having a common identity. He says the social solidarity exists, which arises because a certain number of states of consciousness are common to all members of the same society. And in determining what part of the judicial apparatus is represented by the penal law, we shall at the same time measure the relative importance of this particular part of our solidarity. So this mechanical solidarity, which Durkheim thought was the only kind of solidarity available in ancient or primitive or traditional societies, is also part of our society, which is why we still have a penal law, although we have then on top of it other forms of solidarity. But let's talk more about mechanical solidarity. He says a little bit more about it on page 60 of the chapter you read for last time. He says, indeed, under these conditions of what he's described as essentially a primitive division of labor, which I, having spent a lovely year in Scotland last year, including many visits to the Highlands and representing through here with traditional Highland shepherds, Scotland is in some ways a good example of this because it is a very ancient society and one that has actually had very historically very severe penal laws until fairly recently. Now it's somewhat less punitive than its southern partner in the United Kingdom, England and Wales. But if you go back, I mean, when I was in Edinburgh, I was constantly aware of the number of sites around Edinburgh where people were executed, and there's a whole industry of ghost tours. And how many of you have been to Edinburgh? You'll have visited some of these sites, the Grassmarket, near St. Giles on the Royal Mile. These are all places where people were executed in Edinburgh, and there are a lot of them. Lots of people got executed, and they had very vigorous religious laws. People were executed for blasphemy as late as the 18th century in Scotland. So it is a country that, on the one hand, it's the home of the Enlightenment in the 18th century. It's where Adam Smith and many other eminent Enlightenment social thinkers are gathered and literary figures. But as a whole, Scotland also has this tradition, a history of a very deep, if you will, mechanical solidarity, especially the Highlands, which are always considered the most primitive part of Scotland. Sometimes they don't even speak English or didn't until recent generations in these parts. And mostly what people did in the Highlands was raise sheep. Until much of the population was driven off in order to create a much more commercial sort of farming business. But go back far enough, everybody's a shepherd. And that gives you at least a simplistic picture of what Durkheim had in mind. Primitive or traditional societies, it's not like you'd have the kind of complex division of labor we have. Instead, pretty much everyone was taking care of sheep or doing other things related to the reproduction of life, cooking, cleaning, etc., but around this basic activity. Now again, it's not so clear that, well, I should say it's pretty clear that Durkheim was wrong even about this. That is that fairly traditional societies, or very traditional societies, can't be at least easily stereotyped in this kind of mechanical solidarity way. Nonetheless, this picture that Durkheim has, that mechanical solidarity is a solidarity that arises from a sort of identification between people. Still, I think there's a valid connection between that and thinking about the penal law, and both the emotionality associated with the penal law, because in many ways it's those, Durkheim thought that these primary identifications were the kind of strongest bonds that we feel, the most emotional ones, but also these are going to be rules or norms, that these penal ones that speak to the parts of our social togetherness that are most uniform, right? So if you think about the criminal law even today, while there's some specialized parts of the criminal law or penal law that apply to people with special statuses, maybe physicians, maybe we saw with the Michael Jackson homicide trial that if you're a physician, you may have special obligations that can come back and bite you in the form of a penal violation. But mostly the criminal law applies to all of us. It speaks to us as not as professors and students or managers and workers, etc. It speaks to us as human beings, or sometimes adult human beings directly in that sense. And that is a real difference. If you think about civil law is much more, some of it applies to all of us, but a lot of it applies to you in your role as a husband or wife, parent or child, tenant or landlord. It belongs to a more complex division of labor. So there's, I think, an important insight here for Durkheim that while criminal law gets cluttered up often in modern societies with lots of particularistic legislation, that there is, especially at its core, a set of penal laws that reflects to us our common humanity, the things that we all share, and also the things that generate, not coincidentally, the strongest emotional feelings. Remember that hot magma sort of rising up from this deep penal layer. Now, Durkheim thought that unlike traditional societies, modern societies did not rely completely on this core of penal law and mechanical identity or mechanical solidarity. Instead, they developed what he called organic solidarity. And organic solidarity is anchored not in our identity with each other, not in the things that we all share, but in fact in our differences. And again, think of Durkheim as a liberal and a Jew in late 19th, early 20th century France. He's saying a modern society doesn't depend on everyone worshiping from the same book or having these core, having a complete worldview that everyone lines up on. Instead, we are a complex division of labor that actually is stronger for those divisions and more capable of sustaining ourselves as a society precisely because of our diversity. Organic solidarity is also based on individualism, right? So there's this paradox. As a sociologist, of course, Durkheim thinks that we're not just atomistic individuals that have to be kind of tethered together through incentives, etc. We have this common solidarity. But he also observes that one of the features of that solidarity in modern society is individualism itself. That is, one of our core values is individualism. And therefore, we kind of come back to the individual as a central value and our sense of rights. Obviously, you can't have a society based on rights that doesn't put the individual pretty close to the center of things. And of course, it's a society in which the rule of law itself has become a kind of value that is a detached professional court system, legal system of the sort that we today are used to. Whereas penal law in traditional societies, according to Durkheim, might have been directly applied by the people themselves. Not only do we have a division of labor in terms of law, the legal system, but we actually value that, right? We value that sense of detachment, impartiality. And there's actually a lot of empirical research by psychologists that show that when modern people go to modern courts, their sense of satisfaction with that experience depends a lot on what they perceive as the fairness of those proceedings, whether the judge treated them in a respectful way, appeared to be impartial. Even if they lose, they turn out to feel better about the procedures because of that. And that's the kind of thing Durkheim would point to and say, that shows you that we've got this, that the law itself and professional legality has become part of our values. Now, just as the penal law reflects to us, perhaps in a distorted mirror, but nonetheless reflects to us the mechanical solidarity that remains part of our culture, but was even more important to traditional societies. Modern civil law, what Durkheim calls restitutive law, right, law that's interested in restoring people or giving them restitution rather than punishing them and seeking expiation, becomes essentially the representation of this organic solidarity is in our civil legal system. And think about some of the things that you may study here in legal studies, or if you go on to law school, obviously the law of contracts, which is an important, very important body of essentially private governance that allows individuals and associations to create very complicated legal systems all their own, very much exemplifying both the value of the rule of law and the value of individualism, and represented in a whole body of law, which, by the way, law students kind of love because it does reflect this sort of very aspirational, very balanced, and at least in its ideal form, seemingly very just kind of a legal regime, although when you study it, you'll see that it's got lots of problems as well. And here you'll see that the goals of compensation, restoration, and sometimes the elimination of discrimination, which is something that Durkheim was beginning to see developments of after the Dreyfus Affair, but is really much more part of our own time, the rise of civil rights law and ultimately of human rights law. Now, this all comes out of Durkheim's 1893 or 6 book, The Division of Labor. He writes a lot in his career, and I can't possibly summarize all of it. I will put an additional recommendation on the syllabus or up on the website associated with Durkheim of some readings that you might want to do if you're continue to be interested in Durkheim. I just want to briefly comment on one final publication of Durkheim's in which he came back to this question of the penal law, and instead of seeing it as a division of labor does, as a contrast between mechanical solidarity and organic solidarity, this kind of fixed ideal types, two different ideal types. In this essay, he looks at change over time, essentially in European, primarily legal systems. And he points to, this is an essay called Two Laws of Penal Evolution. It appears in L'Année Sociologique, which is a very foundational journal of sociology that Durkheim is, as you can see, the editor of at this time. And he publishes his article in that journal. And Durkheim points to two different laws, he says, of penal evolution. We can both put the term law in quotes here because we probably don't have the same kind of confidence that Durkheim did that social science produces iron laws the way that natural science does. And we can probably also bracket or put in quotes evolution because I'm not sure we necessarily view this as progress as clearly as Durkheim did. But in any event, as you can now, I think, begin to imagine, having tools to think about change over time as opposed to just these ideal types of traditional and modern society could be a very valuable thing for those of us interested in plumbing more recent patterns, especially here in California. So what's the quantitative change that Durkheim's interested in? This is actually a revolution in leniency, which we will be studying in many ways in different parts of the course, in the level of punishment, the intensity, if you will, of punishment. And what Durkheim argues here is that, and it's not clear how empirically valid the data he has is, but it actually is, from what we historians can now reconstruct of essentially penal change, it captures at least the pattern of the 19th century and into the 20th, and that is he thought that punishment was getting more lenient over time, quantitatively. So if we're talking about prison as a dominant form of punishment, as it was by Durkheim's time, he thought that prison sentences were getting shorter over time, something pretty strange in our era where they've gotten a lot longer. Perhaps even more important is the law of qualitative change. Within Durkheim's lifetime, public executions, which were still somewhat practiced, if not common, in the years of his birth, much more common, we'll see, in England than in France, and generally, certainly for the generations before Durkheim, painful physical torture or death or symbolic degradation tended to be the dominant forms of punishment. In Durkheim's own time, imprisonment in some kind of penal establishment or colony had become the dominant serious punishment. And Durkheim pointed out this is a qualitative change. You're moving from a physical assault on the body or symbolic assault on the body to a form of punishment that is qualitatively different, that tries to preserve the integrity of the body, that is gentle compared to severe. Now, we'll see that the prison has its own problems, and there's a critique of the prison as cruel in many respects. But certainly for Durkheim's generation, he accepted the common view that the prison represented a significant qualitative shift toward leniency and away from a very exacting kind of punitive impulse. Now, how would he explain this? Because after all, he told us in the division of labor that the desire to punish comes out of this common consciousness, that it that has a very hot and emotional quality to it, and that even though modern society has lots of other forms of solidarity and a wide body of civil law, it continues to have this penal law. So what would make that kind of punitiveness go down over time? And in this essay, he begins to give us some additional tools to think about. One of them is secularism. Of course, Durkheim, as a Jew in the Third Republic, was very conscious of the contestation of the role of religion in public life in France. Officially, France was a secular republic, but as the Dreyfus Affair showed, there was a lot of popular feeling and mistrust across religious lines, etc. Nonetheless, Durkheim, as most of his contemporaries, observed that Europe at the end of the 19th century was far less religious than it had been at the beginning of the 19th century. And had he lived to the end of the 20th century, he would feel very confirmed by this, right? I mean, America is a little bit of an outlier here, but when you go to Europe, churches are largely empty. I mean, certainly Western Europe, Eastern Europe's a bit different. Religious expressions of faith are in public are minimal. People's attendance at church or observance of religious formalities has declined to some extent catastrophically in terms of sustaining organized religion. For Durkheim, this secularism, whatever else one might say for or against it, is associated with a significant lessening of the level of penal heat. And again, go back to his assumption that in the most traditional primitive societies, what is primarily driving emotional heat in violations of these foundational, fundamental values is the religiousness of those values. So if you blaspheme, or if you violate the laws of kashrut or halal in a community where that is considered the uniform practice of everybody, you're not only perhaps offending the taste, etc., of your neighbors, you're bringing about the possibility that the deity may seek vengeance against the whole community. And there's plenty of examples, if you will, in the religious tradition of that kind of collective punishment, right? Sodom and Gomorrah, among others. Therefore, religious societies, according to Durkheim, are especially punitive because they're trying to demonstrate, or even on a conscious level, their emotional heat is being generated by a fear of and a desire to appease the deity. In a secular society, in contrast, we recognize crimes primarily as offenses against individuals. Sometimes groups or the nation, and those, by the way, like treason, tend to be the most harshly punished even today. But since individuals are not gods, even though we may be at sort of the center of our value system, we don't demand emotionally the same level of punitiveness. However, Durkheim suggested that over time, this was going to level off. He said, as society becomes more and more secular, it sort of purges this religious fervor that's in the penal law. And so at a certain point, it's not going to keep getting more lenient, he thought. And indeed, because the individual becomes more and more important, we might imagine that it's possible that the penal law would have a certain floor as to how lenient it could get, because our celebration of the individual is connected to a sense of outrage when the individual's rights are violated, and especially when the individual's rights are violated in a permanent and traumatic way, say by violence. Finally, in this essay, Durkheim offers us another possible explanation for variation. He says even in modern societies that are fairly secular, where we might expect leniency to be the norm and penal severity to have leveled off, you may see periods where it goes back up again. And he speculated that what would drive this would be the rise of essentially nationalism or statism. If people begin to treat the state as a kind of god, then it's possible they will begin to demand punitive sanctions for things that violate state law. So think about the intensity of punishment of political offenders in essentially authoritarian, totalitarian, ideologically motivated societies, whether communist, fascist, and sometimes theocratic, say contemporary Iran, where one of the most frequently punished capital crimes is essentially a form of blasphemy, making war against God, which essentially is to be out of line or to be attacking the position of the state. So Durkheim didn't live to see fascism in Europe, but this would have completely fit his model, and indeed later sociologists would show that punishment levels, the quantitative